want to welcome you to the second Core Concepts lectures. So this is a little bit different because we're bringing in people from all over the country, in fact, to speak to you about their core concepts, their beliefs. And that's because we want to know why they believe it and what they're doing about it. And so you'll have a chance to hear about different paths. All right. This is not something where we are endorsing any particular path. Most of our work has to do with the primary of identifying and verifying each principle from your own life experiences. In other words, it's like turning on the lights so you can see the door to what path you might want to follow. All right? And so these are free. You can pick up one and listen to that you can listen to in your car. It's a brief on the 4 DVDs that are part of the Laws of Material Wealth Personal Development Program. You've been listening to Chris Grau, the flying musician. And when our speaker finishes his Q&A period, then Chris has agreed to remain and play as long as anybody wants to dance. So, and our speaker today is Shiva Meucci. And Shiva has gained some notoriety from steampunk physics. All right. So if you'd like to know more about that, then you can go online, steampunk physics. And he's going to be talking about how or what the relationship is, and you can correct me on this, the relationship between physics and spirituality. All right. And it's a very, first book I ever read on anything like that was The Tao of Physics, and that was a long, long time ago. But in talking with Shiva, I was very interested in what he had to say, and I thought you might be as well. Welcome, Shiva.
Thanks, James. Appreciate it. All right. Yeah, so what we're going to be talking about today is, I don't know if any of you have heard of apologetics. It was something that was part of the Christian movement. I think it was the 15th century, something like that, where basically the idea is to have a set of ideas that lead to the reasoning for your belief. I mean, of course, a lot of different religions have their sacred texts, etc. One of the things that, thank you. One of the things that I was interested in, because I actually came from a very religious background. I was brought up fundamentalist Christian, and after a while, there were certain things that. Okay, thank you. There were certain things that didn't really fit for me, and then at the same time, I was also very interested in science. And so you can see this kind of, for me, I came from a kind of a mechanistic type of viewpoint of things. And so you're going to see some of that in here, but I'm going to lead you through some of the process that led me back to spirituality from kind of went through a process of becoming atheist and not really believing in anything spiritual at all. And then as I started studying physics and finding certain things that led me back to spirituality. So this is kind of a apologetics for the New Age. So yeah, I was raised in a machine shop, and then I went on to become a software engineer. So as you can see, a lot of mechanistic type of things there. So one of the first things is to define the soul. Now a lot of times people are going to be uncomfortable with that idea. How do you define the soul? That's kind of putting a box around it already. I'm already in trouble. Well, bear with me. One of the things that I like to do is tell the story of Elijah from the Bible. You know, a lot of times you're going to find me referring back to the Christian Bible, etc. That just happens to be where I come from. But in the story of Elijah, here you have a fellow who he has a sacrifice set out, and he's got a competition between him and the other religions or what have you in this story of the Bible, and they all go and do their thing to set the sacrifice burning, and he says, okay, everybody stand aside, watch this. And they poured buckets of water on it, etc. And then he calls down fire from heaven. Boom! It's melted completely. It's gone. That's the story in the Bible. And now, right off the bat, well, you could say, well, that's that would be a miracle if we were to see it today. But then, from another perspective, well, then what if that was just a meteorite? If that was a meteorite that hit, now is that any less miraculous that say for instance his God had planned the universe from the very beginning of time to create a circumstance where there was a meteor in orbit that would decay at just the right moment that his servant calling upon it would fall and hit that exact spot. Is that any less miraculous just because I can put my finger on it? I don't think so. I think it's still a miracle, and just because we can put our finger on something doesn't mean it's not miraculous. And I think the same thing can be said of the soul. I think that that it may be possible to actually define the soul, and there actually may be a physical mechanism for the soul that does not make it any less miraculous, but simply shows that perhaps science can catch up with what spirituality has known for a long time. One of the things that I like to point out is that creative people tend to get the jump on the more logical people. They see things before the logical people do, and you'll see this happening over and over, where artists and authors and things like that will predict something, and then eventually science will catch up. And that's just kind of the nature of the beast. Because at the same time, one of the things is your creative mind, you look up in the clouds and you see a rabbit. And right away you're able to recognize that pattern, but then there's some part of you, that would be your more rational self, that has to go and check behind and find out, well, is it really a rabbit? Is it on the ground? Well, no, already so it's not really a rabbit, it just looks like one. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to do here, is to come behind what spirituality has already recognized and see if we can actually provide a mechanism for it. And the answer, in my opinion, is yes. So what I'm wanting to talk about is the ether. Now, you may have heard of the ether before, because it's a very ancient concept. It's known as the Akasha from the Vedas. And Einstein's theory of relativity was actually based upon another theory that you don't hear much about, called Lorentz's ether theory. And so during the 19th century, the ether theory was a physics concept. It was something that was not thought of as magical in the slightest. It was just simply something that light had to travel through. Now, of course, like I said, it came from ancient concepts, but at the time, that's how they saw it. So let me give you a quote from Einstein. And this is now one of the things that we know now is that in modern physics, they kind of look down on the idea of ether. So, oh, that's a little bit, we don't want to talk about that. But here, Einstein, in 1920, this is 15 years after, 15 years of considering his own theory, he said this: according to the general theory of relativity, space without ether is unthinkable, for in such space there would not only be no propagation of light, but also no possibility of existence for standards of space and time, measuring clocks or rods, nor therefore any space-time intervals in the physical sense. So if we're talking 15 years after the person who came up with the theory of relativity, that supposedly says there's no ether, he himself says there is an ether. And so that by itself, kind of says something to me. They also believe that in modern times that ether is incompatible with modern physics. But this was only up until the 1970s when, up until the 70s, it was still debated very hotly in scientific circles. There were a variety of Nobel laureates and renowned physicists who weighed in on the side of ether. Louis Essen is one of those scientists. He's responsible for the current extremely precise measurement of the speed of light, in which, by the way, the universe is pretty much made of light, and that's something that is not just a spiritual concept, but it's also a physics concept that is accepted today. So he came up with and was able to measure the extremely precise speed of light, and he also was the inventor of the atomic clock. So here's a guy who really knows about light, really understands it. And in 1978, he had this to say about this special theory of relativity, which supposedly says there's no ether. Students are told that the theory must be accepted, although they cannot expect to understand it. They are encouraged right at the beginning of their careers to forsake science in the favor of dogma. So the point is that chi and other energies like that may actually have a physical medium. They may actually exist, but the thing is, modern science refuses to even look at it, refuses even to talk about it, because to do so may actually end your career. You're not allowed to. There were people, I think it was in Caltech sometimes in the late 70s, where they started revoking tenure for even arguing against special relativity. So it became a dogma, just like Louis Essen was saying. Yet, if we travel back a little bit, we look at Nikola Tesla. Tesla was the greatest inventor of our time. I really encourage you to look up Tesla and find out a little bit about all the different inventions. Most every modern convenience that we have was at its base invented by one man, Tesla, and it was because of his understanding of ether. And the funny thing is, he just laughed at special relativity at the time. He thought it was nonsense, and one of his quotes was, "Today's scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments. They wander off through equation after equation and eventually build a structure which has no relation to reality." So what's this got to do with the spirit? Well, it's an old concept, and let me give you an idea. So you have earth, air, fire, water, and spirit. You've all heard those before. Well, then another way to look at that would be solid, liquid, gas, plasma, and ether. So what I'm saying here is that perhaps in ancient times there was an understanding of reality that was not where you didn't have this separation between spirituality and science, that they were one single thing, and they had a greater understanding than we do now, and we may be starting to come back to that. As a matter of fact, there was a recent convention where a lot of the descriptions of physics by some of the people from NASA, etc., their descriptions were very much like ether, but they still don't want to say ether. Oh, one of the things that to know about Tesla, though. Okay, so how does this relate to spirituality? Nikola Tesla was actually almost a fan of Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda was the man who brought Hindu to the New World, to America anyway. And he followed him around quite a bit, and you end up finding out that there's this great quote by Tesla that's fairly long, but I just love the way that he speaks, and it really says a lot about his respect for Vivekananda. There manifests itself in the fully developed being, man, a desire mysterious, inscrutable and irresistible, to imitate nature, to create, to work himself the wonders he perceives. Long ago he recognized that all perceptible matter comes from a primary substance or tenuity beyond conception, filling all space, the akasha, or luminiferous ether, which is acted upon the life-giving prana, or creative force, calling into an existence in never-ending cycles all things and phenomena. The primary substance, thrown into infinitesimal whirls of prodigious velocity, becomes gross matter. The force subsiding, the motion ceases, and matter disappears, reverting to the primary substance. So here, this is before there was really an understanding of matter and energy equivalence. Here he's not only stating a way that matter and energy are equivalent, he's also stating a way in which the spiritual world and the physical world are linked in the same duality. So let's step back to science for a moment. And let's look at how do we define consciousness? Consciousness, in current accepted scientific terms, can really only be looked at as electrical signals or electromagnetic signals. So you basically, in your brain, you have the center of your brain is a thalamus. It's near the center anyhow, and then near the outside is the cortex. And you have these loops of electrical energy that travel out and come back in, and they do this over and over. So you have this loop inside your brain. And one of the things that's interesting is you'll find that just with using electromagnetic energy, just a very high-powered magnet that is focused in the right place in the brain, you can actually alter someone's moral judgments. So, I mean, these are experiments that they found. I mean, there's no surgery necessary or anything, and you can change the way a person thinks. So obviously, our brains and that which we kind of see ourselves as our spirit, etc., are electromagnetic in nature. It is electromagnetism and what we think of as the spirit seem to be linked in a variety of ways. So the question then becomes, well, okay, so is it the brain that's producing the spirit then, or is it the electromagnetic energy that is actually producing the spirit? So it's kind of a chicken or the egg question. And here's why I have to say that I believe it has to be both. You have to ask yourself the question: is a dry depression just some little valley, slight valley, etc.? Is that a river? Well, of course not. Well, what is a floodplain full of water everywhere? Is that a river? No. It's only when water flows in a specific depression that we consider it a river. And as that river flows through that depression, it cuts its way into it and it changes it. And the exact same thing happens with the way that you encode memories in your brain. As those electrical signals pass through your brain to these different areas, the more that a certain area is activated, the more likely it will be activated in the future, just like a river. And that's how you actually remember things. So it's the combination of that electromagnetic energy and the substance guiding it that gives rise to your consciousness. So one of the ways I like to express this is the rock moves the river, and the river moves the rock. And so you can see that it is not just one thing, but it's only the combination of those two things simultaneously that gives us these phenomena. Okay, now we talked about vortexes, or vortices is what a multiple of them, that's technically what it's called. The interesting thing is, you think of a vortex as like a funnel cloud. And that is a type of vortex, but typically that might be called a two-dimensional vortex. However, there's another type of vortex that feeds in on itself. And the difference between these two is the one that's like a funnel cloud, it will actually begin to break apart. And on airplanes, I don't know if you've ever watched airplanes come down, and you've got these swirls back behind them. Well, they break off into smaller and smaller vortices. Whereas there's another type of vortex called a toroid, which actually stays in one place. Its energy is preserved in one place. And I actually brought a little toroid generator here to show it to you. But basically, it might be helpful if I, excuse me, if I use this for just a moment. So to describe a toroid, because it's a little difficult, you have to imagine like a donut. So if I were to look at it from the top, it's going to have your basic donut shape. And it's going to be spinning around, okay? But if I were to look at it from a cutaway side, what I'm going to end up seeing, let me draw this here. Once again, you're kind of seeing the donut here, but I'm seeing it from the side. There's also this motion that is going in this direction. So it's actually turning in on itself as it's spinning. And what this does is this is a three-dimensional vortex, because you can actually kind of see there's a vortex in this direction, and there's a vortex in this direction. So there's two of them simultaneously. And what's important about this kind of vortex is that if I were to try to blow at those cups over there, I can blow all like, and it's never going to reach it. And I could even put in the same amount of energy that I could put into this thing to try to get there, and it still would just break apart before it got there. However, if I take this toroidal vortex generator, and it makes that shape right there, aim it, it'll travel a long distance, and the energy is preserved in one place. Well, it just so happens that in the brain, you basically have the same thing. There is something called, like I said, the thalamus, and I'm going to talk about three different areas of the brain real briefly. That is the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland. And right at the thalamus, it's where it spreads out like that toroid, and goes around and comes back through, and keeps doing this same motion over and over. And that, at the same time, you also produce a magnetic field that does the same thing around your brain. So one of the interesting things about, let's see, let me make sure to catch up with my note cards here. So you have these thalamocortical loops. That goes from the thalamus out to the cortex, back to the thalamus. Well, you have another interesting body that regulates the lower functions. So the thalamus regulates higher cognitive functions, those things which we kind of consider, less animal. And then the hypothalamus is what regulates your heart and all of those lower functions, which is more animal-like. And just between these two bodies, you have something called the pineal gland, and it's at the very center of your brain. Now, the interesting thing about the pineal gland is that happens to be nested between your conscious and unconscious brain, is that it is a light-sensing organ. Now, it has not been proven specifically to sense light in human beings, but it has been proven to be affected by light in human beings. However, we find in a variety of animals that the pineal gland started out at the front of the brain, right where the third eye is. There's animals called triops, for instance, that literally have three eyes, and there's some frogs that their pineal gland has just barely started to sink into their brain, so it's covered over with skin. However, it's very close to the surface, and it directly senses light. So what I'm saying here is that it senses vibrations in the ether. That's what electromagnetic energy is vibrations in the ether. And so you have this way of sensing the ether available. Now, one of the things in the human brain that we do know for sure is that as light goes through our eyes, it kind of passes by the pineal gland, and it regulates sleep and a variety of things like that. However, there have been a number of researchers who have found that there are certain brain chemicals and states that people describe as mystical or as spiritual, in which there's certain chemicals produced that are very active on the pineal gland. So basically what we're looking at here is what has been down through history seen as kind of our antenna to the universe, and scientifically speaking, there's a tremendous amount of proof for that. So so basically the brain acts like a riverbed, and the flow of ether through it is what it changes the river. So you have this flow of ether, you have a flow of electromagnetic energy traveling through your brain, and that changes your brain, and then your brain in turn shapes the way that it goes, just like a river does. And hold on just a moment here. Yes, and the way that the neurons connect, that's actually the storage of information. So in other words, as a river has certain things happen to it. If you were to do something upstream of a river, it would actually have effects downstream that may shape the river. For instance, if you were to put a half of a dam into a river, the way that changed it there would continue to change the river all the way down it. And it would actually, the course of it would be slightly altered, and those alterations would lead to more alterations, etc., etc. And so one of the things that happens is each time that information is accessed in your brain, is it strengthens that connection. So this is called long-term potentiation. It's just part of brain science, current brain science. And so each time it's read, it's either strengthened or weakened in certain instances. So it's a lot like a record needle. I don't know if you're familiar with a record needle, but a record basically starts out as just a disc, and they take a needle and place it on it, and it's a nice sharp needle, and they put enough weight into it that it can start to cut. And then as vibrations come in and to hit that needle as it's sliding across and cutting into the surface, it starts to jiggle. And so it records the information physically into the record. And then what you do is you just take a little more blunt needle and run it across the surface. And then as that jiggles up and down, you amplify it through what you see in those old, I don't know what to call them, stereophones, I forget what they're called. But, and the vibration gets amplified and gets replayed, so that we can actually look at ancient pottery and read, and we've actually heard old voices off of ancient pottery because of the way that they were talking as they were forming the pottery. So it's really fascinating. But so basically what I'm saying here is the pineal gland is kind of like the needle, and that as we are changed by the ether coming through, we also change the ether. And so if you look at, for instance, something that is interesting about magnetic fields, is there around the Earth there's something called the magnetosphere. And so what you see is this big toroid around the Earth, that is the magnetosphere, but it also feeds into the sun. And then in turn, one would assume that the sun also feeds into the supermassive black hole in the center of the galaxy. And then also one would assume from there that that supermassive black hole probably feeds into other galaxies as well. So there's this way in which we are touching the rest of the whole universe, and as it shapes us, we shape it as well. So now I want to go a little different direction, slightly. And so I've been talking about the ether, and I've tried not to get into the specifics of it. I've got a whole series on it, specifically how it works for those who are into physics, etc. And basically, ether is what matter is bubbles of ether. Now these bubbles are maintained through rotation. So like if you were to take two weights on the end of a slinky and spin it, well, it's going to be pulled apart. Same thing happens in matter. It's basically just ether being pulled apart by rotation, which is basically what Tesla had said. That what Tesla had said was in the Vedas. So I'm not saying anything new here. I'm just restating something very ancient. And but then what you have to understand is the ether itself is what's very dense. In other words, one of the ways we can tell how dense something is as vibrations travel through it, the speed that the vibration travels through it is relative to how rigid, how dense, etc. that it is. And the thing is, nothing travels faster than light. So in other words, in pure ether, that is actually densest medium. And so what I'm saying is what you think of as nothing out there is actually the primary substance. It is what's most dense, whereas what we think of as the physical world is actually just this foam. It's basically just bubbles. In other words, it is the thing that is not solid. It is what out there is more solid than what we are. So the funny thing is, then you begin to see these huge bodies of ether between galaxies moving across each other, and as they move across each other, spinning up the galaxies, and this being the point of change for what I would consider the Akashic record, or it's basically the spirit world. And it's the points at which those more change can happen, and change is the essence of experience. So I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the butterfly effect other than the movie. The movie is interesting, but one of the things that I like to point out is if you look at a mountain, and I was to take a basketball at the top of the mountain, and say there's some pointy rock at the top of the mountain, and I drop the basketball. It's going to bounce down the hill, hit a bunch of different places, and I could film all of that, and eventually I would see at the other end it hitting somewhere. And so let's say it hits a tree at the bottom. Now let's back up from there, and then I could look at it and say, well, the reason it hit that tree is because it hit that rock right over there, because I watched it do it. Well, the reason it hit that rock right over there is because it hit that hill at that angle. And I could sit there and trace it all the way back up the mountain to that point, and then find that the way that I placed it, one atom at a time, is what mattered to have that effect way down the line. So this grows into a lot of different concepts. Basically, that your existence in the future will actually have far greater impact than your existence now. But also, the more important thing is to look at it from a certain perspective, and that is, if I were to take a wind-up mouse, now I would make this taped line across that table right there, and then I stuck the wind-up mouse, which just basically goes forward, and on the end, and told you to make it follow that tape. Well, you'd reach in and you'd tap it at certain points, and it would follow the tape around. So did the mouse navigate the tape, or did you? And my point is that you navigated the tape, even though it looks like the mouse did. And so what I'm saying here is that sometimes we end up seeing ourselves as this, center point from which all things flow, where instead of seeing that all things flow into us, and we just happen to be the confluence, the point at which a lot of things happen. And so I would say that you could actually look at the path down the mountain of that basketball as almost like a tube, because everything from wind to you name it, there was thousands of different things all contributing to where that ball ended up. And so what I'm saying is, you often see yourself as that ball bouncing down the hill, but I'm saying that is not the real you, just like the mouse is not the real you. You are the mountain. And that's my talk.
Thank you. Now, if your mouth is still open, go ahead and ask a question. All right, because I know that when we met and talked, I had many questions, and we talked for a substantial amount of time. So go ahead with your questions now. He's available here to talk to you a little bit about what you're specifically wanting to ask. Okay.
Early on, you were talking about is just if you would just clarify a little bit more about the soul. I can't remember your exact words, but it was, does it I can't even remember how to say. How did you say that the soul comes in? Is it the
I would say specifically that there's different ways in which to look at it. From a rational perspective, the soul can be seen as a set of data, and it is a set of. You look at things through your experiences, but those experiences give you attitudes and ideas that affect your everyday life, and your experiences then are expressed through your actions in your everyday life, and so that is actually kind of a set of data that gets expressed. And so in the same way, that information that is stored in your brain, and there's one of the things that they find all throughout brain science is you can remove little pieces of the brain. It's pretty amazing how much the brain is really connected to the way that you think. But what I was saying is that it's only the confluence, it's only the combination of things that really gives rise to a soul. And what I'm saying is that that soul can be seen as that set of data, but at the same time, perhaps we should just see it as as that toroidal flow of ether. And in that way, we are our experiences, our life here, is kind of being played out and also being recorded onto the flow of ether and basically being written into the Akashic record.
Kind of like you were explaining about the record, how something is recorded on a disc or on a polygraph
Exactly.
or something.
Here's the thing. Did you know that a microphone and a speaker can basically be interchanged? You can use a speaker as a microphone, and it's because it's kind of the same thing as that record beam, and so the same thing I believe is true of the pineal gland. It's both a speaker and a microphone.
What question?
One of the aspects of the brain, when you deal with it in its infant state, and when it's a small child, just say from conception, that if it is that much a part of, I'm gonna call it the spirit or that energy, then how does it really come to be what it is?
I would say that it already existed beforehand is the thing. That if you look at, like I was talking about all the effects on the mountain, well, some things actually altered the wind before it hit the basketball. There were things that altered where the rocks were in the first place before the basketball bounced. And so everything that you are actually existed beforehand. And it's a matter of not seeing yourself separate from the rest of the universe. You have to completely annihilate any idea of separation. The separation can be useful, just like certain concepts, like the concept of a wave. A wave is actually, if you have a medium, it's actually getting crushed and then backing back out, and the particles are actually doing something. And we think of it as a single thing, or or the concept of zero. There's no such thing as not existing. There's only things that exist. The idea of something being not or not existing is useful, but it's not really accurate. Neither is the idea of separateness. Separateness is useful for certain exercises, but in truth, we are actually just another part of everything.
But would it not give rise that actually the energy, the ether, did just develop the brain?
Absolutely. That's what I'm saying, is that I believe that there's the possibility. What I've described actually ends up with being a mechanism. Now, I'm not saying I necessarily believe all these things myself. I simply can see that they're possible. I can no longer rule them out, whereas at a period of time in my life, I would have ruled out the idea of past lives and a variety of subtle energies because, well, truthfully, I was ignorant. And now I would say that if those things are stored in the ether, which I know for certain that they are, then those things can be replayed as well. And so there's a line from a song that I like. There's we're one in the river and one again after the fall. And that is that the whole, if you look at all of the ether together and conceive of that as the universe as God or as the one or whatever you want to call it, then that as that begins to play upon the physical world as it's happening, because here's the thing, the physical world and the spiritual world are happening simultaneously. They are one and the same. In other words, if you believe that the ether, this fluid, is basically being spun up and turned into physical matter, then that physical matter is constantly flowing, and so ether is flowing across it, into it, and out of it, just like if you look at a river, sometimes you'll see a little current, a little eddy, and it'll spin right there in front of you, but the river's continuing to go. So what is right there? There's nothing but just some spin, but that the water is actually moving past it, whereas the little vortex looks like it's right there. And what I'm saying is, yes, that play upon the human mind that is not just physical but also spiritual at the same time is what creates you. But the thing is, instead of seeing yourself as this as this small thing, you should instead see yourself as the larger thing. Just like you should not see yourself as the mouse that you moved. In other words, that little mouse that's moving across the table, well, that's not really you, and that's in this physical body. That's not really us. What is truly us is the thing that moved it around, the universe, the one. And so, in other words, we are that thing that is the universe. We are that one, and when we see ourselves as separate, we begin to lose contact with what I would conceive of as God, and I think a lot of other people as well. Funny thing is, this actually relates to the idea of Shinto and everything being made of consciousness. All of these things are actually part of how I began to see the way that these things interact, and see that it's like, wow, there are all these ancient understandings that have been around since who knows how long, and they seem to come back again. So I hope that answers your question.
And now physics enjoy
Yes, exactly.
What was that?
physics is now dabbling in.
Yes, they're just starting to.
Chris?
Yes, I've thought in the days gone by quite a bit about what you were talking about. In my astronomical readings, I read about chaos theory. And also, I've tried to figure out whether life is a broad highway or a fine line. Because a lot of times I'll think about like decision making. I have to be careful at times. I can paralyze myself thinking, how is this one small decision going to affect so many things in my life?
That's right.
Oh, God.
And then I have to step back and say, just make the decision. So it's kind of a combination of both. On the one hand, I want to think through the choice that I'm making. But on the other hand, if I overthink it, I get into trouble. So I can just play both ends out too far and end up doing nothing.
Absolutely. Analysis paralysis is what's called in
Right.
programming.
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anybody have a question? Yes, Pam?
Well, we die, we leave, and we have through this basketball that's gone around, and we've accumulated all this information over this lifetime. And so, of course, our physical body completes, but our soul, our spirit goes on to higher planet. And I assume we take all that information with us. Well, when we come back in reincarnation, you think we bring that information back, some of it, or where does that information go? What is it used for? Why are we accumulating all this information lifetime after lifetime? Who gets it and what are they doing with it?
Well, in my opinion, I think that God is, which would be the universe, is basically creating experience. In other words, perfection, absolute perfection, cannot have experience because it can't change. Because if it's perfect, how can it change? And so if you can't have change, you can't have experience. So therefore, you have to have imperfection. And I think that when specifically dealing with your question of well, is this information stored? Where does it go? Well, I believe as you're experiencing it, you're writing that one small line into the ether, which with your pineal gland, as you're having these thoughts, you're writing it into the ether, and it's going out into the universe. And sometimes it's collecting with other pieces of information, other lives, and may come back in its one form, or it may. Here's the thing: there may be eddies, there may be whirlpools of ether that are so large that we can't see them. Like, let me give you an example. There's something called a dust devil that you can only see at the ground level. But if there's a lot of, if it's out there in a farm and they've kicked up the dust a lot, you can see how far it goes way up there. But the reason why you don't see it normally, above that level, it's still there. You just can't see it. And the reason for that is it just hasn't reached a certain speed where there's a transition point that affects the air in a certain way. So the same thing may be true of the spiritual world, in that there may be these whirlpools, there may be these places where consciousness, instead of being that one long drawn out thing, may actually come back together in what may be a spirit. And it may be in that one specific place because for some reason or another it's decided to be there, etc. And we simply can't see it because of the fact that it's not spinning at a rate that is fast enough to disturb the ether the way that one atom would, because an atom is spinning at the speed of light in a very tiny area. So the point is that I believe that information may go out and may add to the record, and it may just simply be an experience for ourselves. In other words, we're just something to do. you know, if you got a lot of time. But at the same, one of the things that I like to talk about was, you know, where are all the problems of the world come from? Well, imagine you could create a little world that happens really, really fast, and you're just kind of messing with it, and then, you know, but the thing is, if it's happening so fast, even though you are vastly more intelligent than what might be happening there, or you may be much larger, just like, let me back up for a moment. Say you try to catch a fly. Well, you can't typically catch a fly very well. Are they smarter than you? No, they just happen to be smaller and think faster. So if you made this little world and you accidentally kind of spilled a beaker or whatever, you might actually cause a tremendous amount of suffering for thousands of years in their time, and it'd be completely an accident. And so I'm saying that, you know, I think there is as above, so below is true, that if you were to look at God, I don't believe that it can be perfect if God wants to have experience. And so therefore, certain things are kind of well, I got to try to get it to that level, and sometimes God would not, just because God may not react in the same time period that we do, or I actually see God as a fractal. In other words, there are many different levels at which that consciousness exists. But if you were to, you know, have an accident, well, you might be really sorry about it, but it just happens too fast for you to do anything about. And I kind of think that's where each one of us is kind of a god on our own plane. If we look at like to an insect or to an animal or something like that, you know, we're magic monkeys. They see us do really crazy stuff that they could never understand, and we're like gods to them, you know. And so the same thing, but at the same time, we may accidentally hurt a dog. It's like, oh, I don't know how to explain to you that was an accident, and they're just thinking, why did you do this to me? You're so mean. And, you know, it's like, well, it was an accident. It's like, but you're so much smarter than me. I thought you were perfect. Well, no, not really.
Now, she gave you a definition that I call Mozart, because he came in with everything. What, 3 years old, what did he do? Played concerts, you know. So the collection that maybe was just in that one soul returned and returned and returned and then produced Mozart.
Absolutely.
Or either it was spread out and spread all over and he picked up vestiges of others.
Exactly. He just tuned to different frequencies.
Yeah, yeah. I like the idea that it was collected in that one soul. Because if you look at certain geniuses, you think, okay, but Einstein collected his information after he got here. Some of it was his wife's.
Yeah, actually.
Yeah.
Very few people know that.
And, but.
And he was not even a good student.
That's right.
Yeah.
He was very good at synthesizing. But I think that some souls do collect from life to life, or maybe they didn't need to, you know?
Maybe they just had access to the one, and he was able
That's
to
right.
read certain parts of the
Yeah,
Akashic record.
yeah. Now, a musician is you know, they get different energies from, as an artistic person, they have receptors that we ordinary people don't have.
With certain musicians, they have, what's it called? You remember?
Savant abilities?
Well, not just savant abilities, where they actually hear things and see things at the same time.
Synesthesia?
Yeah,
Synesthesia.
and they see music visually,
Mhm.
and I think it's the highest art.
Yeah,
Because-
and artwork is a beautiful language. I do agree with it.
But music is higher than anything. And you take someone like Dr. Oz, I think he's next to a musician, but he's brilliant. But I mean, these people come in, I think, in toto, already collected.
I would say that may be true, or that may
Yeah,
be
we
simply
don't
that they're already tuned to a specific frequency. They're born at this,
They've
and that
been
information
doing
becomes.
it for generations. I mean,
That's
for
possible.
They're
lives and lives.
already channeled in.
Already.
Let me ask you one, you mentioned light with the same word of speed of light. And the objective of finding the unified field has still continued even though Einstein died trying to do it, right? And, or the field, or the theory of everything.
Right.
And some of the later ones that are still working on that have come with the thought that light doesn't have any speed at all. We think that there's a speed because we have a mathematical calculation for the time, but the fact that light just is.
Yeah, that's somewhat based upon special relativity, and you'll find if you look at steampunk physics and some of the other things, actually I have a problem with a certain area of special relativity, and that is the one thing that seems to be wrong about it. Now you have to understand that any kind of theory is based upon a broad base of knowledge that came beforehand. So special relativity wasn't developed in a vacuum. It's just based upon Maxwell's equations, based upon Lorentz ether theory. It's based upon a lot of different things. But there was one thing that he added that I think actually kind of sent us down the wrong path, and that is that light travels the same speed in all frames of reference. Now, I know that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense when said out loud, but it's this idea that kind of goes with what you're talking about, that light doesn't have any speed at all. And at the same time, that same idea that light doesn't have any speed at all could also say that light speed is also infinite. All of these things can come from there. But my personal beliefs, I believe that the universe works. And I believe that, and like I said, this is something that every person has to find on their own. But on my spiritual path, I have found that I don't believe that there's any such thing as a paradox in the universe. I believe that this is the one
accident.
thing. Yeah, or accident. I believe there's
Because
any.
the difference in dropping the basketball from here and from here
It's going to make a huge
is a difference.
Exactly, and perhaps that's the one thing that I don't know, and I'm curious about. Is there some maker that at a certain level that has a very perfect plan? Because things certainly always they work like clockwork to a certain extent. And so then, is there some maker at a higher level that has a perfect plan, or is it something that can only be dealt with in kind of a generality? Perhaps it's and the point at which that things change is the point at which ether is no longer interlocking, and so it can kind of actually come together in a somewhat random fashion. And for me, that's still something I'm searching.
Are there some other questions? Wasn't that interesting?
Very
Yes.
much so.
And we're attempting to do that with each week.
Thank you, Sheila, that was very interesting, thank you.
I want to remind you that in September, next week, we have Norma De Jesus will be with us. Thank you very much. Norma De Jesus will be here, and she'll be talking about South American shamanism. And she spent some time.
Oh, okay. Like come
You
back up. All right.
Being back in.
Yes.
You need to close out with him or something?
Okay.
Yeah, I need one more experiment.
You can always edit.
You look like you've been shot at when he did that originally, Chris.
Oh yeah, you can feel it. You should feel it all the way across it. Okay, watch her hair. Here we go. All right.
Did harder than that.
Oh, that's
Hey.
All right.
With this, you could do away with that song about not spitting into the wind.
Yeah, that's right.
One more time.
All right.
One more time.
One more
Oh,
time.
one more time. All right, we gotta set up. Let's go here. One more time. See if I can knock it off pretty good.
There you go. Completely. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Um,